I first noticed something was wrong with Steve long before he admitted it, long before he said those words that would twist everything we thought we knew. It started with the way he looked at people, or rather, the way he didn't. Steve had always been the kind of man who faced conversations head-on, direct, clear, unflinching. But in those weeks leading up to the revelation, he moved through rooms like a ghost trying not to be seen. He listened too closely, watched too carefully, breathed too quietly. Whenever someone entered the room, he would go still, not the stillness of someone resting, but the stillness of prey, listening for footsteps in the grass. At first, I chalked it up to stress. We were all cracking under the pressure. The whole department was held together not by trust, but by mutual exhaustion. Reports vanished. Files returned with new corrections that nobody claimed to have made. Requests went unanswered. And every week someone new got blamed. People whispered that the system was falling apart. But Steve looked like a man who knew it wasn't falling apart by accident. One night I stayed late. The corridors were nearly empty. Only the hum of the old ventilation system filled the building. I headed back toward my office and saw a light under the door of the archives room. Nobody worked there that late. I stepped closer, slow and silent. And there he was. Steve sat on the floor surrounded by open boxes that were supposed to remain locked at all times. Documents lay scattered around him like he had been searching for a single piece in a 1,000-piece puzzle. He didn't notice me at first. He was whispering to himself, not words exactly, but fragments of sentences like, "No permission? How did this pass review? Not possible unless..." His fingers traced lines in handwritten notes, comparing signatures, checking initials, squinting at timestamps like his life depended on it. "Steve," I said quietly. He flinched, actually flinched, and turned sharply toward me. For a brief second there was something fearful in his eyes, a kind of fear I'd never seen on him before. Not fear of me, fear of being seen. Then it vanished, replaced by that brittle calm he'd been wearing for weeks. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I frowned. "I could say the same about you." He gave a hollow half-smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Fair enough." I looked at the disassembled chaos around him. "What are you digging through?" He rubbed a hand over his face, tired lines forming at the edges of his eyes. "History," he murmured. "Or what's left of it." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "Steve, talk to me. What's going on?" He hesitated, a long hesitation, like he was weighing whether telling me would endanger me too. Then he picked up a torn, yellowed page and handed it to me. "Look at the date," he said. I did. 2 years earlier. "And now look at the authorization signature." I looked, but something felt off. The handwriting was too familiar, too recent, and the ink wasn't the type used back then. "This signature wasn't made in 2023, I whispered. Steve nodded slowly. "No," he said. "It wasn't. It was made last month." My stomach tightened. Someone was altering the past. I stared at the document, then at him. This is serious. Who would even have the clearance to..." He cut me off with a look that said he already knew, a look that said the truth had been clawing at him long enough to leave marks. "Someone who never should have had that clearance to begin with," Steve said. His voice was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that weighed more than shouting. He stood, wincing as though sitting on the floor had drained something vital from him. "You can't tell anyone I was here." "Steve?" "No one," he repeated, stepping closer. "Not yet. Not until I'm sure." His eyes locked onto mine with desperate intensity. "If they know I'm onto them before I'm ready, they'll bury this, and me along with it." Those were his exact words. I remember because they replayed in my mind for days afterward, over and over, like a warning I didn't understand yet. He gathered the documents hurriedly and stuffed them into a folder that already looked twice as full as it had been designed to be. "Come on," he said. "We shouldn't be in here." As we stepped out into the hallway, the lights flickered. Just once, but long enough to make us both stop. Steve glanced up at the ceiling. His jaw tightened. "Someone's monitoring the grid," he whispered. "Steve, you're being paranoid," I muttered, even though I didn't fully believe it myself. "No," he said, not looking away from the lights. "I'm being careful. Paranoid is when you think someone is after you without evidence. I have evidence." He turned to me. "I just don't know where it leads yet." but I could see it in his eyes. He did know, or at least, he suspected, and it scared him, more than anything else ever had. The next morning I found Steve already at his desk, not sitting, standing, as if lowering himself into the chair would waste precious time he didn't have. His screen glowed with a dozen open windows, spreadsheets, archived emails, scanned records, timestamps zoomed in to the pixel. He wasn't just reviewing information, he was dissecting it. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. I stepped closer. "Steve." Finally, he tore his eyes from the screen. There was a wildness in them, not manic, not unhinged. Something else, something like clarity sharpened by terror. "I think I've found another one," he whispered. "Another what?" He didn't give me time to ask. He opened a file, a simple maintenance report, routine and boring, except for one thing. "Look at the timestamp," he said. I looked, and felt the same jolt of wrongness I'd felt the night before. The timestamp didn't match the digital signature. The document had been entered on a day when the system was offline for scheduled updates, meaning no one could have uploaded anything. And yet, here it was. "Someone bypassed the system," I murmured. Steve nodded slowly, and not from the outside. I fell silent. He didn't need to explain. To do what we were looking at, to change official records across multiple departments, required access that only one person held. One, single, person. But I still wasn't ready to believe it. They could have spoofed his credentials, I suggested weakly. Steve stared at me, not angry, but disappointed. "You think I didn't check that? Look." He clicked another window. A security log appeared. Encrypted access patterns, authentication sequences, all matching his terminal, his ID, his biometric confirmation. "You can only spoof this if you physically drag his hand across the scanner," Steve said quietly. The weight of those words settled between us like a thick layer of dust. I leaned back, exhaling. "So the question is whether he did it himself, or someone forced him." "No," Steve replied instantly. "No one forced him. Look." He opened a surveillance clip, time-stamped at 2:14 a.m. The camera quality was poor, grainy, black and white, full of artifacts, but clear enough to see a figure entering the server wing, alone, calm, unhurried. Steve froze the frame as the figure turned toward the camera. It was him, the man whose name would later freeze the entire conference room. He wasn't scared. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. He looked like someone doing exactly what he meant to do. I felt my chest tighten. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered. "He's always been reliable, quiet, invisible." Steve cut in. "That's why he got away with it. He made himself part of the background. The kind of person you forget is in the room." He stepped back from the screen. "People like him don't rise through charm or competence. They rise through silence." His voice dropped. "And silence is the perfect weapon." I watched Steve pace, restless, electric with a kind of nervous energy that scared me more than the evidence did. "This goes back years," he said. "Longer than we've been here. Maybe longer than anyone realizes." He grabbed a stack of folders, thick, overstuffed, worn down from constant handling. "These are the anomalies no one explained," he said. "Shutdowns, misdirected reports, disappearances of small but crucial data packets." He opened the first folder. "I thought they were accidents," he murmured. "Everyone did. But accidents don't form patterns." He pointed at the dates. They formed a sequence, a deliberate rhythm, like someone marking time. "All of these," Steve continued, "correspond with decisions he approved." "Coincidence?" I asked without believing it. He shook his head. "These aren't coincidences. They're breadcrumbs." He pulled out another document, a transfer order. "You know what this is?" he asked. "A standard reassignment." "No," Steve said. "It's a cover." He pointed at the authorization code. "That's his handwriting." I frowned. So, Steve said, voice sharpening. "Look at this." He opened another file, one from 11 months earlier. Another reassignment. Different department. Different reason. Same handwriting. And another. And another. His hand in every major shift the organization had undergone. "You're telling me he orchestrated all of this?" I whispered. "For what purpose?" Steve tapped the table twice. a habit he had when he didn't want to say something too soon. "That's what I'm still figuring out," he said. "But I know the outcome." He swallowed hard. He wanted control. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Control of what?" He lifted his head. "Everything." The silence that followed hit harder than any answer he could have spoken, because Steve didn't exaggerate. He didn't speculate. He didn't make leaps without evidence. If he said this man was behind it all, he wasn't guessing. He knew. A knock on the door jolted us both. 3 soft taps. Measured. Even. Almost polite. Steve froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid, like prey smelling a predator. "Don't move," he whispered. The knocks came again. Same rhythm. Same chilling calm. "You expecting someone?" I whispered. He didn't answer. For a moment, we both just stood there, barely breathing. Then a voice filtered through the door, a voice that made the blood drain from Steve's face. "Steve," the man said, "are you in there? I need a word." It was him, the one Steve had been investigating, the one whose silence filled rooms like smoke, the one whose hands were all over the evidence. He was standing right outside the door, waiting, patient, listening. I saw Steve glance toward the monitor, toward the open files, the incriminating documents, the proof he wasn't supposed to have. His eyes widened. "He can't see this," Steve whispered. I reached for the power button. "No," Steve snapped softly. "Turning it off will look suspicious." The doorknob rattled, just slightly, as if the man was testing whether it was locked. Steve's breath quickened. I'd never seen fear take hold of him like this before. Never seen him look like someone standing on the edge of discovery and destruction at the same time. "Steve," the voice called again. A little firmer now. A little closer. "I know you're there." Steve backed away from the door, shaking his head. "He knows," he whispered. "He knows I'm digging. He must." "What do we do?" I asked. Steve's eyes darted to the window, to the desk, to the door. "We wait," he said finally. "For what?" "For him to leave." But he didn't leave. He stood there, unmoving, silent, listening to Steve's silence, listening to our breathing, listening for any slip that would confirm his suspicions. And in that moment, that long, breathless, stretched-out moment, I understood something. Steve wasn't paranoid. He was right to be afraid, because the man outside that door wasn't knocking because he needed to talk. He was knocking because he wanted to know whether Steve had finally found him. Steve took a slow breath, as if bracing himself for a memory he wished he could erase. But that night, changed everything, he said, lowering his voice, letting it stretch with tension. He remembered it with disturbing clarity. The cold rain, the flickering street lamp, the quiet hum of the city around him. Indifferent, unaware, unbothered. Steve had been walking home, replaying the conversation he'd had earlier with Callahan, the one where he'd first sensed that something was deeply wrong. But it wasn't until he reached the alley behind his apartment that the pieces of the puzzle started clicking into place. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Not a stranger. Not some random bystander. Someone Steve recognized instantly, even though he desperately wished he didn't. Jordan Hale, a former colleague, a man Steve once trusted, a man who left the agency under unclear circumstances, as the official explanation politely phrased it. But there he was, standing inches from Steve, soaked in rain, eyes burning with a mixture of fear and urgency. "You're in danger," Jordan had whispered, "but not for the reasons you think." Steve didn't know whether to run or to listen. Jordan was trembling, but not from the cold. "They're watching you. Everything you do, every step you take, every question you ask." He stopped, swallowing hard. "It's all being recorded, and it's not Callahan pulling the strings." Steve tried to ask who was behind it all, but Jordan cut him off. "Don't say anything. Not out here." He leaned closer. "You think Callahan is the problem? You think he's the villain? Steve, Callahan is just a pawn, a front, a distraction." Steve's heartbeat quickened. Jordan looked around, paranoid, frantic, then whispered, "You want the truth? Look deeper. Don't look at who benefits publicly. Look at who stays invisible." Before Steve could respond, headlights appeared at the end of the alley. Bright, sudden. They washed over the brick walls like a floodlight. Jordan's eyes widened in terror. "They found me." He shoved a USB drive into Steve's hand so fast Steve barely felt it. "Don't trust anyone," Jordan hissed, "especially not the man you think is protecting you." He backed away into the shadows. "If they catch me, I was never here." And then he was gone. Moments later, the car sped off the moment Steve turned toward it. No license plate, no identifiable marks, just the lingering sense that someone had been watching every second. Steve looked down at the USB drive, his fingers shaking. He didn't know it yet, but that tiny piece of metal was about to unravel everything, expose the hidden architecture behind people he thought he understood, and point to a culprit far more dangerous than Callahan could ever be. Because on that drive, in one encrypted folder, was a pattern that would show where the lies began, who orchestrated them, and why Steve had been chosen as the one who must never discover the truth. Steve leaned toward the microphone now, letting his voice drop to a whisper, and that's the moment I realized. The real villain wasn't the man in the meetings, it was the one in the shadows. He paused, and soon I was going to say his name out loud. But at the time, Steve didn't even know what Jordan meant. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know why he'd been targeted. What he did know, what hit him like a punch, was that someone had been fighting desperately to keep him away from the truth, and he had just stumbled onto it. Steve rubbed his palms together as though trying to warm himself from a memory that still chilled him to the bone. "When I got back to my apartment," he began, "I locked the door behind me, and for the first time in years, I checked the peephole 3 times before stepping away." He slid the USB drive into his pocket, his fingers brushing against it like it was a live grenade. The room was quiet, too quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed muted, as if the whole world held its breath. Steve walked to his desk, opened his laptop, and hesitated. Something inside me said, "Don't plug it in. Don't do it. Because once you see what's inside, there's no going back." But curiosity, or maybe instinct, won. He inserted the drive. At first, nothing happened. Just a blank folder named Archive 47. He clicked it. It asked for a password. Steve frowned. He tried the obvious choices, dates, names, old project codes, but nothing worked. Then he remembered Jordan's final words, "Don't trust the man you think is protecting you." And suddenly it clicked. There was one phrase that had circled around Steve's work for months, a phrase Callahan repeated in every briefing, every memo, every late-night message, a phrase that he insisted wasn't important. But Jordan had taught Steve one thing long ago. When someone dismisses something over and over, it's because it matters. Steve typed in the phrase, "Stay aligned." The folder opened. Inside was a single video file. Length, 000944. Name, Oversight, 1001. Steve hovered the cursor over it for a long, uneasy second. Before he could play it, the screen flickered. A pop-up appeared. "Warning, external monitoring detected." Steve's breath caught in his throat. The message repeated, again and again. Then his screen went black. For 3 seconds, nothing, only silence. Then a face appeared on the screen. Not Callahan's, not Jordan's. Someone Steve hadn't seen in over 5 years. Marcus Renner, a man Steve once admired. A man Steve believed had disappeared from the agency, either retired or vanished on his own terms. But here he was, sitting in a sleek, dimly lit room, staring directly into the camera, as if he had been waiting for Steve all along. Renner leaned forward. "If you're watching this," he said calmly, "then Jordan betrayed protocol. And you, Steve, you're about to learn why your name has been on our list since the beginning." Steve felt his entire chest tighten. Renner continued, "Callahan is not your enemy. He never was. He's simply a handler, a buffer between the truth and people like you. But the real coordination, the real oversight, that's me." Steve whispered into the mic. "I knew it. I knew it was him." But the video wasn't done. Renner clasped his hands together. "Everything you've investigated, every anomaly, every missing file, every contradiction in your reports, it all leads back to a single directive." He paused, almost savoring it. Directive 47. Steve's blood ran cold. That code had appeared dozens of times in redacted documents, always blank, always inaccessible, always above his clearance level. Renner leaned closer, his eyes dark. This directive was designed years before you joined us. It identifies individuals who possess a certain cognitive pattern, people who notice things they weren't supposed to notice, people like Jordan, people like you. Steve swallowed hard. Renner continued, "You were never chosen because of your skills. You were chosen because you were predictable, containable, someone we could observe." Steve felt his pulse pounding in his ears. Renner nodded slightly, as if answering unspoken questions. Callahan's role was simple: keep you under the illusion of autonomy, monitor your reactions, redirect your curiosity just enough to keep you stable. Steve clenched his jaw. "But you deviated, didn't you, Steve?" Renner's voice lowered. "You began asking questions you weren't assigned to ask." He leaned even closer, filling the frame. "And that is why Jordan approached you. He wanted to break the cycle." Steve shifted in his seat. Renner's final words felt like a blade sliding between ribs. "But understand this. Jordan didn't give you that drive to save you. He gave it to you because he needed someone else to take the fall." The screen went black again. Steve exhaled shakily. "That moment," he said now, "was when I realized the truth wasn't just deeper. It was darker than anything Jordan had hinted at." He leaned into the mic. "And that someone had set me up from the start." He paused. "But I wasn't ready to say the name out loud. Not yet." Steve inhaled slowly, steadying his voice, as if the memory itself still vibrated inside his mind. "I didn't sleep that night," he said. "Not for a second." Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Renner's face staring at him from the black screen. Calm, confident, certain. A man who didn't threaten. A man who promised. And that terrified Steve far more than any threat could. He replayed the video again and again, searching for details he might have missed. A reflection in Renner's glasses, a background noise, a hidden timestamp, anything. But the more he watched, the more he realized. Renner wanted to be seen. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He wasn't afraid. Because Renner believed, truly believed, that Steve was already trapped beyond escape. Steve rubbed the bridge of his nose. "But he underestimated me," he said quietly. They all did. He opened his laptop again, determined to examine the file at a deeper level. He checked the metadata. Creation date, redacted editor, restricted source, unknown node, access level required, Tier 5. Tier 5 didn't even exist on public clearance maps. The realization sent a cold ripple through him. Renner wasn't just a supervisor, Steve said. He was in an entirely different classification, an entirely different world. He pressed deeper into the data, forcing his software to scan for hidden layers. There were traces of something, fragments of code that didn't belong to any known encryption system, stretching and looping like strange digital fingerprints. And then he found it, a concealed tag buried deep inside the file, almost invisible. One word, Nexus. Steve stared at it for a long moment. Nexus. It wasn't a department. It wasn't a directive. It wasn't a code name he'd ever heard in any official capacity. It was something else, something older, something foundational. He whispered, "Nexus, what the hell are you?" And then, as if answering him, his lamp flickered. The lights in his apartment dimmed, just for half a second, then returned to normal. It was probably nothing, most people would have thought. Steve knew better. He scanned the room. His phone lit up by itself. No notifications, just the home screen. A tiny pulse of light, like a heartbeat. He picked it up. The battery indicator was full, but when he clicked the side button to turn it off, the screen didn't go dark. Instead, a line of text appeared across the top. "Remote access enabled." Steve froze. Another line appeared. "User, Nexus root." Every hair on his neck stood up. A small vibration pulse followed, and then a message popped up. A message he absolutely knew he hadn't typed. "You should stop." Steve swallowed. He set the phone down carefully, as though it were a venomous creature. Then, as he watched, the phone wrote another message on its own. "You were not selected to question the system." Then another. "You were selected to obey it." Steve's pulse hammered in his ears. The final line appeared. "Your deviation has been logged." And then the phone shut itself off. Not powered down, not restarted. It died, instantly, like the battery had been yanked out, even though it had just shown 100%. Steve dragged a hand across his face, his breath shaking. I realized then that Renner wasn't watching me, he said softly. Someone above Renner was. He stood up from his desk and stepped back from his laptop, his instincts screaming that the walls themselves might be listening. But then he remembered Jordan, the alley, the desperation in his voice, and the one undeniable truth. If Steve didn't find answers now, he never would. He grabbed the USB drive again, turning it over in his fingers. Something about Jordan's final words replayed in his mind. Look at who stays invisible. Invisible, untraceable, untouchable. The kind of people who didn't need titles, didn't need offices, didn't need public faces. People who controlled information, not through authority, but through invisibility. Steve exhaled slowly. If Nexus was the hidden system, then Renner wasn't the architect. He paused. He was just the enforcer. The real architect, the real villain, was someone Steve had known for years, someone who'd always stood just far enough away to avoid suspicion, someone who orchestrated everything, quietly, surgically, without leaving fingerprints, someone who believed Steve would never put the pieces together. Steve leaned toward the mic, his voice dropping into a tense whisper. And I finally saw who it was. He swallowed, and for the first time, I said his name out loud. But he didn't reveal the name yet, not to the audience, not even to himself in this moment, because the story wasn't finished. Not remotely. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength, as if the next chapter of the story still left an aftertaste of dread in his mouth. The next day, he began slowly, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I went back to the office. Even saying it now, he shook his head. The agency building was a place he once felt safe in, a fortress of order and structure. But that morning, the moment he stepped through the sliding glass doors, something felt wrong. Not visibly wrong, not obviously wrong, but structurally wrong. The receptionist who usually greeted him didn't look up from her screen. Security didn't ask for his badge. They simply nodded him through. No one made eye contact. No small talk. No glances. Just silence. A silence that carried weight. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed something even stranger. Every door he passed was closed. Every single one. That had never happened before. The agency thrived on open doors, rapid communication, and constant movement. But now, it felt like a hospital at 3 in the morning. Sterile, still, waiting for something terrible. Steve approached his office, gripping the USB drive in his pocket. He turned the handle. Locked. His office was never locked. He frowned, pulled out his badge, and pressed it against the reader. The reader flashed red. Access revoked. Steve stared at the message, his heart tightening. Before he could react, he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, heavy. He turned. 2 security officers stood at the end of the hall. Not the usual guards. These men were different. Posture too perfect. Demeanor too calm. Operatives. Higher clearance. Higher authority. And unlike the friendly, casual guards Steve knew, these men didn't smile. They didn't greet him. They just stared. One of them spoke. Mr. Harper, Director Callahan would like to see you. Steve forced a nod, masking the panic rising inside him. Of course, he said. He followed them, but his mind was racing. Did they know about the USB drive? Had Renner already contacted Callahan? Was this a trap? Or was Callahan about to reveal something Steve wasn't meant to hear? They reached the elevator. The guard pressed the button to the lower floors, levels Steve had never been assigned to. The elevator doors opened with a cold, metallic hiss. Inside, the air felt stale. The ride down was silent, the kind of silence where every second stretches like elastic. When the doors opened, Steve stepped out and immediately felt a chill. The lighting was dimmer down here, the walls concrete, lined with old security scanners and reinforced doors. He'd heard rumors about floors like this, floors that didn't appear on any official map, floors reserved for programs that didn't exist. One of the guards gestured. Room 13. Steve walked down the corridor. His footsteps echoed, the sound unnervingly loud in the empty space. At the end of the hallway, he saw a door marked only with a black square. No nameplate, no labels. The door opened automatically as he approached. Inside was a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. A camera mounted in the corner blinked red. Waiting for him, hands folded, expression unreadable, was Director Callahan. Steve sat. Callahan didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. Finally, he said, "You've been busy, Steve." Steve kept his voice steady. "I'm not sure what you mean." Callahan exhaled slowly, almost disappointed. "Don't do that. Not now, not with me." He tapped a folder on the table. "You accessed unauthorized material last night." Steve's stomach tightened. Callahan continued, "You communicated with Jordan Hale. You opened a restricted file, and you triggered monitoring protocols you were never meant to know existed." Steve tried to stay calm. "If Jordan reached out to me, it means something is wrong." Callahan's expression hardened. "Jordan Hale is a rogue asset. He's unstable. You should have reported the contact immediately." Steve leaned forward. "Jordan said you're not the one I should worry about." Something flickered in Callahan's eyes. Not fear, but fatigue. "Jordan is manipulating you." Steve shook his head. "He gave me a drive. Inside it was a message from Renner." Callahan closed his eyes for a brief moment and whispered something Steve didn't expect. "Damn it, Marcus." Steve blinked. Callahan rarely used first names. He rarely spoke emotionally. But right now he looked almost human. Callahan opened the folder. Inside were photos of Steve. Dozens of them. Walking to work, leaving coffee shops, talking to co-workers, entering his apartment. Some were taken from angles Steve couldn't comprehend. Rooftops, street corners, hidden cameras. "Renner's watching you," Callahan said. "He has been for years. Jordan tried to warn you, but he didn't understand the full picture." Steve's voice grew sharper. "What picture?" Callahan took a breath, then looked Steve directly in the eye. "Nexus is not a system, Steve." He hesitated. "It's a person." Steve felt his entire body tense. Callahan continued, "A person who operates outside any command chain, above all clearance levels, above all oversight." Steve whispered, "Who?" Callahan exhaled shakily. "The one person who knew you better than anyone. The one who put you on this path. The one who made sure you were monitored from your first day." He paused. "The real mastermind behind Directive 47. Steve leaned in. Breath caught in his throat. Callahan finished, "Is someone you've known your entire career." The room felt colder. The walls felt closer. Steve's pulse thundered in his ears. Callahan lowered his voice to a near whisper. "Someone you trusted." Steve swallowed hard. He knew exactly who Callahan meant. The name was already forming on his tongue, and when he finally spoke it, when he said it out loud, everything would change. Steve didn't speak at first. He couldn't. The name sat on his tongue like a weight, like something too heavy to lift, too dangerous to release. His breath was shallow, barely audible in the silent concrete room. Callahan watched him, not impatient, not irritated, but almost sympathetic. "Say it," Callahan murmured, as though coaxing a confession out of a wounded man. "You already know." Steve swallowed tightly, because he did know. He'd known since the moment he first saw the hidden metadata, since the moment the phone lit up with messages no human should have typed, since the moment Renner appeared on that video, calm, collected, certain Steve would crumble. There was only one person who fit the pattern, one person who stayed invisible, one person who had access no one questioned, one person who could construct a system like Nexus and operate it from the shadows without leaving a trace. The person who hired him, the person who promoted him, the person who taught him how to question everything, and then punished him for doing it. Steve felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. "It can't be him," he whispered, almost to himself. Callahan closed the folder, lowering his gaze. "It is." Steve's hands trembled. He didn't want to say the name, because once he said it out loud, the truth would no longer be something he could deny or rationalize. It would be real, permanent, irreversible. "Why?" Steve asked suddenly, his voice cracking. "Why would he do this? Why monitor me? Why any of this?" Callahan leaned back, rubbing his temples, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Because he needed someone like you, someone who notices patterns, someone curious enough to follow breadcrumbs." He paused, but obedient enough to stop before going too far. Steve felt the words hit him like a blow. Obedient, predictable, containable. Everything Renner had said. Callahan continued, "You were a test case, Steve, a long-term observation project. Directive 47 wasn't about protecting secrets. It was about studying you, Steve's jaw clenched. Studying me for what? Callahan's tone darkened. For control. A cold tension filled the room, spreading like ink. Steve felt his throat tighten. So, Nexus, Callahan nodded slowly, isn't an organization. It's one man, one mind, one architect. He lowered his voice. The only person in this agency with clearance high enough to monitor Renner, override my access, and erase your entire file without authorization. Steve's breath shook. You're talking about... A sharp metallic bang echoed down the hallway. Both men froze. The camera in the corner flickered once. Then again. Callahan's eyes widened with real fear. We don't have much time, he whispered, standing abruptly. Steve stood too. Another bang. Closer now, like a heavy door slamming open. Callahan grabbed Steve's arm. Listen to me. What you found, what Jordan gave you, Nexus wants it back, and he sent someone to retrieve it. Steve's heartbeat thundered through his chest. Who? Callahan's expression hardened. Renner. Steve's mouth went dry. He's here? He's been here for hours. The lights flickered. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Calm, unhurried, confident. Footsteps Steve recognized. Callahan leaned in, voice trembling for the first time. You need to run. Steve stared at him. You're coming with me. Callahan shook his head, a small broken smile crossing his face. I can't. Not anymore. I've been compromised since the moment you opened that drive. Steve felt a punch of dread in his stomach. They're monitoring this room, Steve. They're listening to us right now. Steve reached for the USB drive in his pocket, the only piece of evidence he had left. Callahan saw it and shook his head sharply. No, don't take it out. If Renner sees it, he'll kill you before you reach the elevator. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A shadow appeared beneath the frame. Slow, deliberate. Callahan stepped toward the door, placing himself between Steve and the entrance. He whispered one last sentence, a sentence Steve would remember for the rest of his life. The man you're afraid to name, he's afraid of you now. The door handle turned. Callahan shoved Steve toward the back wall. Run! The door swung open, and Marcus Renner stepped inside. Calm, confident, silent. His eyes locked onto Callahan first, cold, analytical. Then they shifted to Steve, and he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a friendly one. A smile of ownership. A smile that said, you were never out of my reach. Steve's entire body went cold. Renner spoke, voice smooth and steady. You've been very busy, Steve. Steve didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Renner stepped further in, closing the door behind him with a soft click. A click that sounded far too final. And now, Renner said, folding his hands, we're going to talk about why. Callahan moved between them. You're not touching him. Renner tilted his head slightly, amused. David, you're still playing the hero? Steve saw the flicker in Callahan's eyes. He was scared, deeply scared. Renner stepped forward, and Callahan did something Steve never expected. He attacked. He lunged at Renner with everything he had. For a moment, just a moment, Steve thought Callahan might win. But he was wrong. Renner moved with terrifying precision, blocking Callahan's strike and slamming him against the wall with a force that echoed through the room. Callahan collapsed to his knees, gasping. Renner didn't even breathe heavily. He looked at Steve again. You have something that belongs to me. Steve backed toward the corner, heart pounding. Renner smiled. Say his name, Steve. Steve's voice trembled. Renner took a step closer. Go on. Steve swallowed. And finally, after everything, he said it. Quietly, barely above a whisper, but out loud. The name of the man behind Nexus, the man behind Directive 47, the man who'd controlled Steve's life from the shadows, his mentor, his protector, his architect. Steve said the name. Adrian Mercer. Steve leaned forward, his voice steadier now, but tense, like a man who was finally ready to speak a truth that had been crushing his chest for far too long. You want to know when everything truly clicked? He said slowly. When I realized the one person I kept trying to protect was the one orchestrating all of it. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. For weeks, Steve had been chasing clues, reading encrypted files, comparing dates, locations, and signatures. Every lead had seemed disconnected, fragmented, a puzzle thrown into the wind. But the more he dug, the more he began to notice something unsettling. Every road, every encrypted message, every anomaly led back to someone he trusted implicitly, someone who never appeared in the spotlight, someone who never left digital traces, someone whose presence was felt only in the gaps, in the silence between events. And at first, Steve refused to believe it. He fought against the idea, argued with himself in the dark hours of the night, told himself he was wrong, paranoid, overthinking. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you try to ignore it. It was that USB drive, Jordan's last desperate gesture, that finally dismantled Steve's denial. Inside one of the encrypted folders was a hidden subdirectory titled, simply, Root. Steve at first assumed it was some kind of system log, but when he opened it, he found something chilling. Time-stamped audio recordings, snippets of phone calls, meeting transcripts, policy drafts rewritten at the last minute, orders given through intermediaries who didn't know who they were working for. At the center of it all was a single code name, the Architect, a cold, deliberate strategist who manipulated people without ever revealing their face. But then Steve found one file, a file that wasn't supposed to be there, a file someone forgot to scrub. It was a voice recording, faint, distorted, but unmistakably real. A voice he knew, a voice he once trusted with decisions that shaped lives. And the moment he heard it, Steve felt something inside him collapse. "I'm authorizing the misdirection now," the voice said calmly. "Make sure Callahan takes the fall. He's built for it. And keep Steve occupied. Tell him whatever you need. He must not find out yet." Steve froze. The voice was not Callahan's. It wasn't Jordan's. It wasn't any public figure. It was someone he genuinely admired, someone who had mentored him, someone he believed was on his side since the beginning. Director Marcus Hale, Jordan's older brother, the man everyone respected, the man everyone thought was protecting the agency, the man who taught Steve to always question the obvious, the man who had been pulling the strings in absolute silence. Steve's throat tightened as he continued his story. "It made me sick," he said, his voice trembling not from fear, but from the echo of betrayal. "Because for years I defended this man. I trusted him. I believed his guidance was honest." He rubbed his temples, remembering the moment everything came full circle. Marcus had always stayed just far enough away, always playing the wise mentor, always speaking in riddles that only made sense later. And now Steve knew why. Marcus was the true architect. He had manipulated Callahan, threatened Jordan, used Steve as a blind shield, and steered every event from the shadows, eliminating obstacles before they even understood they were targets. But Steve didn't say Marcus's name yet, not out loud, not until he had proof strong enough to confront him without being silenced. Instead, he turned to the audience, steady, resolute, determined. "When I speak his name," Steve whispered, "there's no going back." He looked down at the recorder in front of him. And that moment comes next. The penultimate tension throbbed in his voice, the sense that he was standing right at the edge of something explosive. "Because the real villain wasn't hiding in the dark," Steve said, almost with disbelief. "He was standing right next to me. For years." A long, weighted silence. "And now," he added, "I'm finally ready to say his name out loud." He didn't speak it. Not yet. That revelation, the final blow, was saved for the conclusion. The ending that would shatter everything. Steve sat in front of the microphone for a long moment, staring at the blinking red light as though it were a countdown to a truth he could no longer hold back. His fingers curled slowly into fists. His breath steadied, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a weight that seemed to bend the air around it. "Everything I've told you, all of it, leads to one person." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calmness made it even more terrifying. One man orchestrated the lies. One man engineered the chaos. One man manipulated allies, silenced witnesses, and used all of us as pieces on his board. A deep breath. "And that man is Marcus Hale." The words echoed, sharp, undeniable. Steve felt his entire body tense as he finally said it. The name he'd been afraid to confront, afraid to even whisper. But once spoken, there was no taking it back. Marcus Hale is the architect. He's the one who watched us, tracked us, redirected us. He set Callahan up. He cornered Jordan. He controlled every narrative. Steve closed his eyes, letting the truth settle into the room like dust. He could almost hear Jordan's trembling voice in the rain-filled alley. Don't trust anyone, especially not the man you think is protecting you. Now it all made sense. Every hint, every misdirection, every shadow that followed him. Marcus had built the entire structure of deception, layer by layer, until everyone around him acted without even knowing who was pulling their strings. Steve continued, voice tightening. He created the illusion of chaos so he could operate unnoticed. He spread misinformation disguised as internal conflict. He forced loyalty by engineering crises only he could solve. And then, quieter, and he used me. That confession hurt more than naming the villain. Steve swallowed hard. He used my trust as a shield, my doubts as a distraction, my silence as a weapon. The microphone picked up the faint tremor in his breath, and for a long time, I let him. A long pause, a heavy one, but not anymore. Steve leaned in, speaking now not as a victim but as a man who decided he would no longer hide behind fear or uncertainty. The tone of a witness, a whistleblower, a man who finally understood his role. I'm putting everything on record, he said slowly. The files, the timestamps, the recordings, all of it goes public today. His voice hardened. If Marcus Hale wants to silence me, he's already too late. He reached for the USB drive, the same one Jordan had passed to him in desperation, the same one that exposed the entire architecture of deception. He looked at it for a long moment, almost respectfully. Jordan died trying to get this to me. Callahan was framed to protect Marcus, and I won't let their sacrifices go to waste. Steve slid the drive into the port. A soft click, a quiet hum. The computer screen lit up. The files began uploading, one after another, irreversible and unstoppable. Steve watched the progress bar climb. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't shaking, he was resolute. When the upload reached 100%, he finally spoke again. Marcus Hale built a system of shadows, a breath. But I just turned on the lights. Silence followed. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of confusion, the silence of truth finally spoken. The kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. Steve stood up, leaving the recorder running, deliberately, defiantly, and walked out into a world that would soon learn the name he had just spoken out loud. Marcus Hale, the architect, the man who once controlled everything, could no longer hide.